Hi everyone, welcome to my video blog for Seminar 2. I decided to research Parkinson's disease, and the article I found is titled Effects of Vestibular Rehabilitation on Fatigue and Activities of Daily Living in People with Parkinson's Disease, a pilot randomized controlled trial study. Now, Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease, and basically it's broadly classified as a movement disorder. People living with Parkinson's, they experience rigidity, stability issues, bradykinesia, and all of this really leads to a big impairment in balance. Now, a person living with Parkinson's typically will communicate that they have a very high fear of falling. And so that fear of falling really creates this cycle where they tense up, they tend to take smaller steps, and it's there that perceived fear of something happening, which actually, of course, is very high when you have a motor disease. So that fear of falling is very real for them. But that perception of the fear also leads to these other impairments. And that's why I was really excited to research vestibular rehabilitation and how that program could possibly benefit someone living with Parkinson's. Now, I chose this article because it particularly dealt with fatigue. And like I just mentioned before, I feel sometimes when we are working to improve dysfunction, it's not only what the body is doing, but it's that patient's perception of also what is happening. And I know fatigue of anything that's happening to your body can create a fatigue. For example, I always think of, going back to being in labor, and labor pains are not the worst pain you'll ever experience, but it's enough pain to make you so exhausted because the pain lasts forever, it seems. It just doesn't go away, and it's hours and hours of this cycle of pain, and that's really all you can think about. Maybe you can also think of having just a headache or a migraine where you maybe just have to put yourself to bed because it's so hard to just focus on your activities of daily living when all you can think about is that pain. And that pain causes this fatigue that really sets in. And typically you and I, maybe if we have a headache, can just put ourselves to bed. But what happens if you're living with Parkinson's? So the article that I focused on took two groups of volunteers, two groups of 12 into a blind study. They took 12 participants, people living with Parkinson's anywhere from stage 1 to stage 4, and put them in a case group. Now, this case group worked with vestibular rehabilitation, and the other 12 participants were just a control group. They did light stretching, warm up, some rotation of the core, and patient education. And after a 8-week program of 3 times a week for 60 minutes of these two defined programs, they did a post-test. Of course, they started with a pre-test. And the neat thing about their pre-test and post-test were it really focused not necessarily of what was happening physically, but their perceptions of their fatigue and their activities of daily living. Now, the 3 questionnaires they used for their pre and their post-test were the Parkinson's Fatigue Scale, the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale, and the Functional Independence Measure. Now, they use these 3 questionnaires to assess how their patients and their participants were feeling. And through the work of this vestibular program, or the case or the control group, which was just basic exercises, they then redid the questionnaires, and they came up with a really significant result of the people with the vestibular program really reported reduced fatigue as well as improved activities of daily living. Now, with these 2 convenience samples, I will say 24 participants is a very small group. Again, I mentioned that was a convenient sample, which means it was also just volunteer based. One of those word of mouth, hey, we're doing this program. If you know anyone who wants to participate, they can volunteer. I think I would like to see in the future another program very similar to this vestibular research that focuses maybe on different stages and comparing the different stages and how this vestibular program worked. Also, maybe a longer study so we could see if these effects lasted for a long period of time, if this perceived fatigue really did reduce, or if it was just a short-term result. I'd also like to mention, I think a really neat thing about this research is it did include, of course, the ocular motor aspect. So vestibular rehabilitation is always going to include head and neck movements. So head and neck movements in a static position, a dynamic position, which is typically walking, as well as ocular motor exercises. And so participants can either go back and forth between looking at a far and close item. They can do exercises that really focus on head and neck movements while staying with a gaze. And this research really did comment to say that oculomotor exercises may play an important role in neuromuscular reorganization, as ocular motor pathways are thought to be impaired in Parkinson's disease, which is reflected in worsened postural control. So these exercises might improve the coordination of the head, torso, and pelvic girdle movement during walking and help to maintain the postural stability. I think this is really great insight into what we can accomplish with simple exercises. And I think that was a strength of this research. For example, I've read other research that said that we can improve Parkinson's, people living with Parkinson's, their balance by putting virtual headsets on and having them do a virtual experience. But that's not always going to be very cost effective now, to say to your patients, go home, buy a $300 Oculus, and then we can put you on these home exercises. But going back and forth between looking at two items or focusing your gaze while moving your head and neck are things that anyone can do anywhere. So when we're going through in that clinical model decision-making process, of course, we look at what goals they have and then what precautions or contraindications, and then we think about our interventions. And vestibular rehabilitation is a great intervention because it's cost effective and super convenient and always accessible. It's something that we can teach our clients to do in the clinic, but then they can take it home and easily replicate these simple exercises to also hopefully get a long-term lasting effect. So I hope you guys enjoyed this mini presentation on how vestibular rehabilitation can affect fatigue and activities of daily living with people living with Parkinson's. So as always, you guys keep working hard. I know everyone here in this program is doing a great job, and the more that we can learn, the more we can help people.